Today, we are going to look at the Second New Deal. The Second New Deal is a continuation of the New Deal programs that FDR created to help Americans struggling in the Great Depression. Another alphabet soup program that we will look at is called the WPA, or Works Progress Administration. This is another program that created jobs for mostly young men performing unskilled labor, things like building roads, bridges, creating buildings that were good for the public. But this particular program was unique in that it also gave jobs to people like artists, teachers, musicians, actors, and it paid them to do whatever their craft was. For example, creating artwork, or acting on the radio, or creating, here's another very famous painting that we will talk about in just a few minutes. We will also look at the Social Security Act. This act had the probably most far-reaching impact of any other alphabet soup program. This one is still in effect today. This particular program is going to give old age pensions. That means that it is going to pay Americans once they reach a certain age. It is going to take them out of the job market. This will open up jobs for younger Americans to then take those jobs that have been filled by older Americans. The goal was that this would help the unemployment rate. It is also going to give money to people who had unexpectedly lost their jobs. It finally provided aid or money to families with dependent children. The next act that we'll talk about is the Rural Electrification Administration. And just like it sounds, this law is going to encourage the delivery of electricity to rural or country areas. There were other significant gains that were made for the labor movement as well. The National Labor Relations Act is going to protect labor unions specifically. It is going to create the NLRB, or National Labor Relations Board. This board is going to be created to enforce these labor laws that were created during the New Deal. Whereas in the 1920s, we had seen attacks on labor unions and seen them associated with the communist movement, this law is going to ban those anti-union practices. We also see major strides made with the Fair Labor Standards. This law is going to create a minimum wage and also makes a standard 40-hour work week. After the 40-hour work week, anything over, an employee must be paid time and a half. We also see the growth of two major labor unions, the AFL, or American Federation of Labor, and the CIO, or Congress of Industrial Organizations. These two labor unions grow at very large rates during the 1930s. Not everyone was a big fan of some of FDR's programs. In fact, the Supreme Court is probably the branch of the federal government that resisted some of FDR's programs the most. FDR, two of his programs, the AAA, or Agricultural Adjustment Administration, and the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, were both struck down by the Supreme Court and ruled unconstitutional. Obviously, since Roosevelt created those programs, he did not like that his programs had been struck down and ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. In order to get around those rulings, FDR wanted to add 6 new Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court. He hoped that if he appointed those justices who would serve for life, that they would support his programs and not strike them down. Many critics were very worried that this would be a threat to checks and balances as created by the Constitution. FDR was not successful in adding those 6 new Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court. Women in the Great Depression are often looked over. Well, we do talk about Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was very significant and very important to FDR's programs. She was his hands and feet since he suffered from polio as a child and was disabled from this particular illness and could not walk very well. She was very important, and FDR relied on her heavily as an advisor. We will also see during the Great Depression several women named to very high government positions. For example, Frances Perkins, who you see here in this picture, was named as the Secretary of Labor. She was the first woman in that position. Unfortunately for many women, if they attempted to get jobs outside the home, they faced a lot of resentment. The thought was that if a woman was taking a job, that she was taking it away from a man who needed to provide for their family. Unfortunately, many of these women were the breadwinners for their household. If a woman did have a job, many women still faced lower wages than their male counterparts. And most of the government programs that we have talked about gave preferences to men instead of women. African Americans during the Great Depression also suffered. Mary McLeod Bethune, who was a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, was going to be key in establishing what is called the Black Cabinet. This was a group that is going to be created to advise the president on public policy matters and served as very important advisors to FDR for anything relating to African Americans. Marian Anderson was a very famous opera singer. She was denied the ability to sing at a Daughters of the American Revolution event. Eleanor Roosevelt took a lot of issue with this and established for her to have her very own concert held at the Lincoln Memorial, to which she also attended. And this was seen as a major stride for many African Americans. Unfortunately, while FDR did do things like establish the Black Cabinet, which was created to advise him on matters that related to African Americans, and the support of this opera singer, Marian Anderson, FDR never fully committed to civil rights. He believed there were too many other Americans who were suffering in general. However, this does mark a very important point with African Americans. Up until this point, many African Americans supported the Republican Party and had ever since the Civil War. But during this point in time, you see many African Americans join the Democratic Party because many of them were poor and also benefited from many of these programs created by FDR during the New Deal. Many artists during the Great Depression are going to reflect the reality and the struggles that many Americans faced during the Great Depression. As a part of the Federal Arts Project, which was a part of that alphabet soup program we talked about, the WPA, one of the most famous pieces of art was probably called American Gothic, created by Grant Wood. That is the painting you see on the left. We also see another very famous piece of literature that we've also discussed, The Grapes of Wrath, written by John Steinbeck, talking about the difficulties and struggles during the Dust Bowl. While many Americans struggled on a daily basis with the reality of the Great Depression, we do see the radio become as a very important part of many families. It provided lots of entertainment. And just like we tune in every week to our favorite programs on the television, people did the exact same thing with their radios. Various soap operas that are still on television today got their start on the radio. We have children's programs like The Green Hornet and Lone Ranger, and also variety shows and also plays. Orson Welles did a dramatic reading of the piece of literature called War of the Worlds, where he actually made many Americans believe that we were being invaded by aliens. This was all done on the radio. The movie industry is also going to do very well during the Depression because the entertainment industry served as a great escape for many Americans. While they were watching great movies created by the Marx Brothers or watching these gangster films or movies like It's a Wonderful Life, they could escape their everyday problems. Many famous movies that we have that are still around today were created during the Great Depression. Movies like Gone with the Wind was created in 1939. The Wizard of Oz, also in 1939, and the very first full-length, full-feature animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, was created in 1937. By the end of the New Deal, FDR looked around and said, "I see a third of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished." By 1937, it appeared that our economy was recovering somewhat. In response to this slight recovery, they are going to pull back and cut some of these New Deal programs. Unfortunately, as soon as that happens, the Depression returns almost immediately. However, there were many Americans and many critics of FDR who were opposed to this growing size of our government and the control that that created. As you see in this cartoon, many Americans believe that all of these programs and the government agencies that were created as a result of them tied Uncle Sam down or tied our government down and gave our federal government too much power and too much control over the lives of most Americans. By the end of the 1930s, we unfortunately see that there were many troubling things going on in Europe. We see, as you see in the top picture here, on the left is Benito Mussolini, and on the right is Hitler. Men like this were starting to rise to power in the 1930s. As men like this rose to power, they began turning their governments into communist governments, into fascist governments, socialist governments, and began doing terrible things to the people in those regions. FDR is going to slowly begin turning Americans' attentions to these international affairs and also at an attempt to protect Americans. It is eventually World War II that is going to end the New Deal programs. And in the end, while the New Deal definitely assisted many Americans during the Great Depression, it is World War II and our full entrance into the war that eventually brings us out of the Depression. And we will look at that next time.